Welcome back to the Masterclass, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for Part 40. We've been meticulously building your foundation in inpatient coding and revenue cycle management. And today we are tackling one of the absolute biggest drivers of severity and reimbursement in the entire hospital system. We're talking about secondary diagnoses and the underlying logic of CCs and MCCs. So get your notebooks ready, because this is exactly where clinical complexity translates directly into the data that powers healthcare. But real quick, before we jump in, if you are enjoying this lesson, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel and share it with friends for this free course on Decode Healthcare with Harshal. All right, let's do a really quick recap to set the stage. In Part 39, we mastered the principal diagnosis, or PDX. You remember the golden rule from the UHDDS, right? The principal diagnosis is the condition established after study to be chiefly responsible for occasioning the admission of the patient to the hospital. It's the anchor of our DRG. But let's be real for a second. A patient is rarely just dealing with one single condition. What about everything else happening to that patient during their stay? Well, that is exactly what we are exploring today. Here is our game plan for today's explainer. 1. The UHDDS criteria for secondary diagnoses. 2. The mechanics of CCs and MCCs. And 3. Exclusions and DRG grouper logic. Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1. UHDDS secondary diagnosis reporting criteria. So look, not every single condition a patient has ever had is going to make it onto an inpatient claim. To actually be a legally reportable secondary diagnosis, it has to coexist at admission or develop during the stay. And to put it simply, it must trigger at least one of these 5 specific clinical actions. We're talking clinical evaluation, therapeutic treatment, diagnostic procedures, an extended hospital stay, or increased monitoring. If it doesn't trigger at least one of those things, it's just background noise. And that actually brings us to a huge point of confusion for a lot of new coders: active versus historical conditions. Imagine you have a patient admitted for acute bronchitis. While you're reviewing the chart, you notice they have a family history of lung cancer, plus a personal history of a traumatic brain injury from, say, 10 years ago. Do we code those? Well, ask yourself, are they being actively managed? Usually no. Unless a historical condition actively impacts the current episode of care, meaning it actually meets one of our 5 factors we just talked about, it generally doesn't impact the DRG assignment or the reimbursement rate. We really only care about what is consuming hospital resources right now. Now that we know what actually qualifies as a secondary diagnosis, let's look at why they are so incredibly powerful in revenue cycle management. Let's move into Section 2, understanding CC versus MCC mechanics. Secondary diagnoses that really move the needle on hospital resources are broken down into 2 main tiers. First up, we have ACC, which stands for complication or comorbid condition. These add moderate severity to the patient's overall profile. Think of things like anemia, a UTI, or malnutrition. Then we have the heavy hitters, the MCC, or major complication or comorbid condition. These represent very significant spikes in resource utilization and severity of illness. Classic examples include sepsis, acute renal failure, or acute respiratory failure. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how this plays out in the DRG grouper logic. Take a look at this heart failure DRG triplet. It's kind of like a staircase. If a patient is admitted for heart failure, and they literally have 0 qualifying secondary conditions, they land on the bottom step in base DRG 293. That's low severity. But if they have a CC, let's say a UTI, the grouper upgrades them to DRG 292, shifting them to medium severity. Now, if they have an MCC, like acute on chronic systolic heart failure, they leap all the way to DRG 291, the absolute highest severity tier. So you can see, just one single secondary diagnosis code fundamentally changes the DRG relative weight. Let's put this into perspective and look at the financial impact with a pneumonia scenario. If the patient has simple pneumonia with absolutely no CC or MC, the hospital gets the base DRG weight. Let's just say it's 1.0 for easy math. If the patient also has diabetes with complications, which is a CC, you get a moderate weight bump. But look at the bottom row. If that same patient develops septic shock, an MC, the weight jumps significantly. If a coder misses that septic shock documentation, or if the physician just writes it vaguely, it leads to a total DRG downgrade. The hospital literally loses legitimate revenue for the massive amount of care they just provided. This right here is exactly why accurate clinical documentation and coding are the lifeblood of hospital operations. So right about now, you might be thinking, well, great, I'll just code every single severe symptom as an MCC and completely maximize the DRG. Yeah, not so fast. CMS is already way ahead of you on that. That brings us to Section 3, CC/MCC exclusion lists, and DRG grouper logic. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the ICD-10 system essentially polices itself to prevent double counting. We have very strict conventions. Look at excludes 1. This is a hard, unbreakable rule. It means these two conditions cannot be coded together, period, unless their etiologies are completely 100% different. For instance, type 1 diabetes excludes type 2 diabetes. You just can't have both. Then, on the other hand, there's excludes 2, which is more of a softer rule, meaning both conditions actually can be coded together if both are applicable and clinically present. So the absolutely crucial point here is how this actually applies to CCs and MCCs inside the DRG grouper. You see, the system has built-in exclusion lists. When a secondary condition is inherently part of or honestly just too closely related to the principal diagnosis, the grouper is going to step in and suppress its CC or MCC status. For example, if your principal diagnosis is acute respiratory failure and you try to code COPD as a CC, the grouper literally just says nope. Because COPD is so closely related to the respiratory failure, it gets excluded from counting as an extra CC. It basically prevents the hospital from getting paid twice for overlapping clinical concepts. Let's move to and see how this builds, breaking down the exact chronological logic the DRG grouper software uses. Step 1. The grouper identifies the principal diagnosis, which locks in your base DRG family and major diagnostic category. Step 2. It sweeps through all your documented secondary diagnosis to see if any of them happen to be on the master list of CCs or MCCs. Step 3. It cross-references those CCs and MCCs against the principal diagnosis, using those exclusion lists we just talked about. If an MCC survives Step 3 without being excluded, boom, you get the highest payment tier. So, just to summarize everything we've talked about today in this masterclass, secondary diagnoses are conditions that are actively managed or monitored during the stay. If they are severe enough, they qualify as a CC or an MCC, which can significantly upgrade the DRG weight and hospital reimbursement. But, and this is a big but, they must survive the grouper's strict excludes logic to prevent double dipping on closely related conditions. Now, we've thoroughly covered the medical side today, but what happens when a patient requires a major surgical procedure? Does the PIDX still drive the bus, or does the surgery just completely take over? Well, that is exactly what we are going to uncover in Part 41, where we explore surgical DRGs versus medical DRGs, or procedure logic, and non-OR procedures affecting the DRG. Trust me, you won't want to miss how the operating room completely flips the grouper logic upside down. If you are enjoying this lesson, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and share it with friends for this free course on Decode Healthcare with Herschel. Keep studying those guidelines and ask yourself, when a scalpel gets involved, does the medical diagnosis even matter anymore? I will see you in the next lesson to find out.